Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, to Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks, two farmers in a one-room log cabin in the Sinking Spring Farm in southeast Hardin County, Kentucky, making him the first president born in the West. In 1816, the Lincoln family left Kentucky to avoid the expense of fighting for one of their properties in court and made a new start in Perry County, Indiana. Lincoln later noted that this move was partly on account of slavery. In 1841, Lincoln entered law practice with William Hardin, whom Lincoln thought was a studious young man. He served four successive terms in Illinois House of Representatives as a representative from Sangamon County, affiliated with the Whig Party. In 1837, he and another legislator declared that slavery was founded on both injustice and bad policy, the first time he had publicly opposed slavery. In 1835 to 1836 legislative session, he voted to restrict suffrage to whites only. He would later say that he had been against slavery since he was a boy, but being labeled on as an abolitionist was political suicide in Sangamon County in those years, and so he chose his words carefully when discussing the issue publicly. The 1858 campaign featured the Lincoln-Douglas debates, generally considered the most famous political debate in American history. Lincoln warned that the slave power was threatening the values of republicanism, while Stephen A. Douglas emphasized the supremacy of democracy. While Lincoln won the nomination has been subject of much debate, his expressed views on slavery were seen as more moderate than those of rivals Seward and Chase. Some feel that Seward lost more than Lincoln won, including Seward himself. Others attribute it to luck, and the fact that the convention was held in Lincoln's home state. Historian Doris Kearns Goodwin believes that the real reason was Lincoln's skill as a politician. Most Republicans agreed with Lincoln that the North was the aggressive party, as the slave power tightened its grasp on the national government with the Dred Scott decision and the presidency of James Buchanan. Throughout the 1850s, Lincoln denied that there would ever be a civil war, and his supporters repeatedly rejected claims that this election would incite secession. Meanwhile, Douglas was selected as the candidate of the Northern Democrats, with Hershizel Vespasian Johnson as the vice presidential candidate. Delegates from 11 slave states walked out of the Democratic Convention, disagreeing with Douglas's position on popular sovereignty, and ultimately selecting John C. Breckinridge as their candidate. As Douglas stumped this country, Lincoln was the only one of the four major candidates to give no speeches whatsoever. Instead, he monitored the campaign closely but relied on the enthusiasm of the Republican Party. It did the legwork that produced majorities across the North. It produced tons of campaign posters and leaflets and thousands of newspaper editorials. There were thousands of Republican speakers who focused first on the party platform and second on Lincoln's life story, emphasizing his childhood poverty. The goal was to demonstrate the superior power of free labor, where a common farm boy would work his way to the top by his own efforts. The Republican Party production of campaign literature dwarfed the combination opposition. A Chicago Tribune writer produced a pamphlet that detailed Lincoln's life and sold 1 million copies. It was during this campaign that Lincoln became the first president to have placed his photo on a campaign button. As Lincoln's election became more likely, secessionists made clear to their intent to leave the Union. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina took the lead. By February 1st, 1861, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had followed. The 7 states soon declared themselves to be a new nation, the Confederate States of America. The Upper South, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, and Arkansas listened to, but initially rejected the secessionist appeal. President Buchanan and President-elect Lincoln refused to recognize the Confederacy. Attempts at compromise, such as the Crittenden Compromise, which would have extended the Missouri line of 1820, were discussed. Despite support for the Crittenden Compromise along some Republicans, Lincoln denounced it in private letters, saying, either the Missouri line extended or POP, POP, would lose us everything we gained in the election. That filibustering for all south of us and making slave states of it would follow in spite of us under either plan. While another Republican congressman warned it would amount to a perpetual covenant of war against every people, tribe, and state owning a foot of land between here and Tierra del Fuego. The Confederate States of America selected Jefferson Davis on February 9, 1861 as their provisional president. At his inauguration on March 4, 1861, sharpshooters watched the inaugural platform, while soldiers on horseback patrolled the surrounding area. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln declared, "I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution of the Unions of these states is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental laws of all national governments," arguing further that the purpose of the United States Constitution was to form a more perfect union. He asked rhetorically that even were the Constitution a simple contract, would it not require the agreement of all parties to rescind it? Also, in his inaugural address, in a final attempt to reunite the states and prevent certain war, Lincoln supported the pending Corwin Amendment of to the Constitution, which had passed Congress the previous day. This amendment, which explicitly protected slavery in those states in which it already existed, was considered by Lincoln to be a possible way to starve off secession. A few short weeks before the war, he went so far as to pen a letter to every governor asking for their support in ratifying the Corwin Amendment. By the time Lincoln took office, the Confederacy was an established fact. Lincoln and nearly every Republican leader adopted this position by March 1861. The Union could not be dismantled. Believing that a peaceful solution was still possible, Lincoln decided not to take any action against the South unless the Unionists themselves were attacked first. This finally happened in April 1861.
Historian Alan Nevins argues that Lincoln made three miscalculations in believing that he could preserve the Union, hold government property, and still avoid war. He temporarily underrated the gravity of the crisis, overestimated the strength of Unionist sentiment in the South and border states, and misunderstood the conditional support of Unionists in the border state. Future General Sherman, then a civilian, visited Lincoln in the White House during Inauguration Week and was sadly disappointed at Lincoln's seeming failure to realize this country was sleeping on a volcano and the South was preparing for war. On April 12, 1861, Union troops at Fort Sumter were fired upon and forced to surrender. On April 15th, Lincoln called onto the states to send detachments totaling 75,000 troops to recapture forts, protect the capital, and to preserve the Union. Troops headed south to Washington, D.C. to protect the capital in response to Lincoln's call. Throughout the war, Lincoln showed intense interest in military campaigns. He spent hours in the War Department telegraph office reading dispatches from the field. He visited battle sites frequently and seemed fascinated by scenes of war. During Jubal's early raid on Washington, D.C., Lincoln was watching the combat from an exposed position. Captain Oliver Holmes, Jr. shouted at him, "Get down, you damn fool, before you get shot!" In July 1862, Congress passed the Second Confiscation Acts, which freed the slaves of anyone convicted of aiding the rebellion. Although Lincoln believed it wasn't in Congress's remit to free any slaves, he approved the bill. He felt freeing the slaves could only be done by the commander-in-chief during wartime, and that signing the bill would help placate those in Congress who wanted to do it through legislation. In that month, Lincoln discussed a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation with his cabinets. In it, he stated, "As a fit and necessary military pleasure," and according to Donald, not for moral reasons, on January 1st, 1863, all persons held a slave in the Confederate States will be henceforth forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation was announced on September 22nd, 1862.